Okay, so have you ever thought about like what it would be like to play D&D not as like the good guy, not like the shining knight or a noble mage, but as like the villain?
Oh, absolutely.
To really kind of embrace the shadows and walk a path of power, even if it means like bending the rules or maybe even breaking them entirely?
Yeah, I've definitely thought about that. And actually recently I had a really interesting experience with a tabletop RPG session where our party was like all pirates.
Oh, cool.
But not the romantic swashbuckling kind,
Wow.
More like cutthroat, treasure-hungry, driven by greed and a total disregard for the law.
Yeah, like real pirates.
Yeah.
Not the
exactly.
the romanticized version.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds amazing.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, so I mean, what I find so interesting about playing as a villain is that it really forces you to think differently, right? Instead of like automatically rushing in to save the day, you have to consider all the angles, the potential for personal gain, and the consequences of your actions, which might not always align with what's considered good.
Yeah, totally. And it's like exploring the other side of the coin, like understanding what motivates people who operate outside the boundaries of morality.
Right.
And speaking of exploring that dark side, we actually got this really interesting article from a listener that dives into this concept.
Oh, cool.
It's called Top 5 D&D Archetypes for Building a Truly Terrifying Evil Party of Players. It's by Paul Bellow on LitRPG Reads.
Now, this article, I really like this article because it's not just saying, hey, play a bad guy.
Yeah.
It's really providing a framework for crafting compelling villainous characters with depth, complexity, motivations that go beyond simple greed or a lust for power. It presents 5 distinct archetypes, each with its own unique set of mechanics, themes, and roleplay hooks.
And what I think is really cool is that these archetypes are not just like cookie-cutter villains,
Yeah.
They explore the morally gray areas,
Right.
Those moments where even characters with bad intentions might find themselves wrestling with their own internal conflicts or facing the consequences of their actions.
Yeah.
It adds a whole new dimension to the game.
For sure. And the article kicks things off with the fallen hero, which is a classic archetype, right?
Yeah.
Just ripe with dramatic potential.
Yeah, it's all about contrast between past glory and like present darkness, Like imagine a paladin who's broken his oath, or a knight seduced by forbidden power, or a mage who's turned away from the light,
Right.
There's a sense of tragedy and a fall from grace that makes them super compelling but also dangerous.
Yeah, for sure. And the article gives us a great example character to illustrate this archetype. Suthalan Dravar, a paladin who was like the epitome of chivalry and honor. He led an elite squad called the Silver Vanguard, protecting villages on the frontier from all sorts of threats. But then, during this brutal Knoll ambush, his hesitation to retreat cost his entire squad their lives, along with all the villagers they were protecting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Thalen was the sole survivor, and the guilt just completely shattered him.
Oh,
He
man.
was stripped of his titles, ostracized by his order, and left with nothing but the memory of his failure.
It's like a classic setup for that fall from grace.
Totally.
Where a hero loses everything and is tempted by a darker path.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened to Sir Thalen. His shame and grief just twisted into this burning desire for vengeance, and he was drawn to this shadowy Oathbreaker cult,
Oh, wow.
embracing forbidden magic and vowing to punish those he deemed responsible for the world's corruption.
So he went full on like revenge mode.
Oh yeah, totally. And what's so compelling about the fallen hero is that, their journey into darkness is rarely a clean break.
Right.
They're haunted by their past,
Yeah.
by the ideals they once held dear.
Right.
It's that internal conflict, that struggle between who they were and who they've become, that makes them so fascinating to play.
Absolutely.
Imagine the moral dilemmas that arise. Do they eventually find a path to redemption, or do they succumb completely to the darkness? It just creates so many opportunities for role-playing those internal struggles and exploring those gray areas of morality.
For sure.
Yeah. And so, if the fallen hero represents that descent from grace, our next archetype, the Corrupt Hierophant, takes a different approach to villainy.
Yeah, this is the character who weaponizes faith,
Right.
twisting religious beliefs and doctrines to serve their own selfish and often sinister ends. They might be cult leaders or false prophets or even like seemingly devout figures who've discovered a way to exploit the system from within.
Right.
The article uses this character named Sister Lenora, the shepherd, to illustrate this archetype. She's this charismatic figure who leads this devoted cult and preaches a twisted version of faith that blends like genuine piety with really carefully crafted manipulations.
And what's so unsettling about the Corrupt Hierophant is that they prey on the vulnerable right, exploiting people's belief systems for personal gain. They erode trust in established institutions, and they sow discord among those seeking solace or guidance. It's like a particularly insidious form of villainy.
It really raises those interesting questions about the nature of faith and the role of organized religion.
Yeah.
Like, is Sister Lenora genuinely devout, believing in this twisted doctrine she preaches? Or is it all just a facade, a means to an end? That ambiguity adds a whole other layer of complexity to this archetype.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Okay, so now for an archetype that's a bit more chaotic and unpredictable. The Mad Alchemist.
Yeah, this is the archetype that embodies that classic mad scientist trope. Someone driven by an insatiable thirst for knowledge, even if it means pushing the boundaries of ethics and safety. They're the alchemists, the inventors, the tinkerers who are always pushing the limits, often with explosive results.
Yeah, the article gives us a fantastic example character for this archetype. Dr. Ignatius Greybile, a gnome alchemist whose volatile concoctions and unstable formulas have gotten him expelled from several prestigious institutions. He's like a walking disaster zone, but he's also brilliant, capable of creating incredible inventions when they don't backfire spectacularly.
Yeah, what makes the Mad Alchemist so fun to play is that inherent unpredictability.
Right.
You just never know what's going to happen when they start mixing those potions or tinkering with those gadgets.
Right.
It could be like a stroke of genius, or it could be a catastrophic explosion that levels half the city.
Right.
And their article suggests that Dr. Greybile isn't necessarily malicious. He genuinely believes that his experiments are for the greater good, even if everyone else sees him as well.
Right.
Bad. It's that disconnect between his intention and the outcome that makes this archetype so intriguing.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Okay, now let's kind of shift gears and delve into the shadows a little bit.
Wow.
The Shadow Assassin is up next, and this one really taps into that primal fear of the unknown.
This archetype embodies stealth, precision, and lethality.
Yeah.
They're the assassins, the spies, the silent predators who move like ghosts, striking without warning and vanishing before anyone even knows they were there.
The article uses a character named Cilia Ravelshard, the Widow's Mercy, to illustrate this archetype. She's a half-elf assassin who operates in the shadows, taking down targets with chilling efficiency. She's a master of disguise, infiltration, and poisons, and she always seems to be 2 steps ahead of her enemies.
What's truly terrifying about the Shadow Assassin is that you never know when or where they'll strike.
Right.
They're the embodiment of that constant sense of dread, that feeling that someone's watching you, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move.
Yeah, it's like that scene in every spy movie where the hero realizes they're being followed and they have to use all their skills and cunning to escape.
Right.
The Shadow Assassin just brings that level of tension and suspense to the game.
Absolutely.
And finally, we have the Arcane Usurper, perhaps the most ambitious and cunning of all the archetypes.
Yeah, this is the character who craves power, but not through brute force.
Right.
But through manipulation, control, and mastery of magic.
Right.
They're the puppet masters, the schemers, the ones who pull the strings from behind the scenes, shaping events to fit their grand vision.
Yeah, the article gives a great example character for this archetype. Malric Dustthorn, a tiefling wizard who specializes in enchantment magic. He comes from a noble family, but he was exiled for dabbling in forbidden magic, specifically mind control spells.
Yeah.
He sees himself as a strategist, a master manipulator who can reshape the world to fit his vision, even if it means bending others to his will.
What's particularly unsettling about the Arcane Usurper is that their manipulations can be so subtle, so insidious, they might appear harmless, even benevolent at times, but beneath that facade, there's this hunger for power and control.
Yeah, imagine a seemingly harmless advisor, whispering in the king's ear, subtly influencing their decisions, shaping the very course of a kingdom without anyone realizing they're being manipulated. That's the true power of the Arcane Usurper.
Right.
It's like that classic trope of the evil mastermind who's always 10 steps ahead of everyone else playing this long game that no one else even realizes happening.
Exactly.
It's chilling, but also incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, for sure.
These 5 archetypes, they offer a glimpse into this diverse and fascinating world of playing D&D as a villain.
Right.
It's a chance to explore different motivations, different playstyles, and different approaches to power.
And it's a reminder that even in a world of fantasy and magic, that line between good and evil can be blurry. theory.
Right.
And that the most compelling stories are often the ones that challenge our assumptions and make us question everything we thought we knew.
Absolutely. And we're going to dive deeper into each of these archetypes in just a moment, exploring their mechanics, their backstories, and how they can bring a whole new level of depth and excitement to your D&D campaigns. But first, let's take a quick break.
And these archetypes, they're more than just interesting concepts. Paul Bellows really fleshed them out. He's provided detailed example characters, complete with backstories, stats, and even role-playing tips to help bring them to life at the table.
Yeah, that's what I love about this article. It's not just theoretical. It's practical. You could literally take these characters and drop them right into your next campaign.
Totally.
Yeah.
So let's go back to Sir Thalen Dravar, our fallen hero. The article provides his full stat block so you can see exactly how his abilities and skills translate into gameplay mechanics.
Awesome.
He's a level 7 Oathbreaker Paladin, which, as we discussed, fits his backstory perfectly. And looking at his stats, it confirms what we already suspected. He's built for both strength and charisma. He's a powerful warrior, but he also has that commanding presence, that aura of authority that makes him a natural leader, even if he's leading a charge against the forces of good.
Right.
And what I find particularly interesting is his gear. It's not just functional, it's symbolic of his fall from grace.
Yeah.
He carries his old greatsword, the Radiant Blade, but the sigils of his former order are fading, replaced by the dark etchings of his new oath.
Oh, wow.
It's like he's clinging to the remnants of his past even as he embraces the shadows. And to make it even more poignant, he carries a book filled with the names of the villages he failed to protect.
Oh, wow.
It's a constant reminder of his guilt and his fall from grace.
Imagine the role-playing possibilities there.
Right.
The quiet moments when he opens that book, the flicker of pain in his eyes, the weight of those lost lives pressing down on him.
It adds a whole other layer of depth to his character.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, could he ever find redemption?
Yeah.
Could he ever atone for his past sins, or is he destined to walk a path of darkness? These are the kinds of questions that can really make a campaign come alive.
For sure.
So speaking of complex motivations, let's take a closer look at Sister Lenora, our Corrupt Hierophant. Her backstory is a fascinating study in ambition and manipulation.
It really is. And unlike Sir Thelen, who was born into privilege and fell from grace, Sister Lenora started with nothing. She grew up in poverty, learning to survive by her wits and her ability to read people.
Okay.
The article suggests she was practically a con artist from childhood.
Wow.
Scouting out wealthy pilgrims and using her knowledge of religious doctrines to gain their trust and, of course, their money.
Wow. So it's almost like she was destined to become a religious manipulator.
Yeah, she had a natural talent for it, and she honed those skills over years of practice. And eventually, her street smarts caught the attention of some actual priests who saw her potential and took her under their wing.
Oh, wow. Talk about a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Right. She rose quickly through the ranks of their order, the Sunlit Covenant, but she was never truly content with just following the rules.
Yeah.
She saw the hypocrisy, the corruption, the way those in power exploited the faith of the masses for their own personal gain, and she realized that she could do it better.
So she decided to create her own version of faith, one where she was in control.
Exactly.
Wow.
She discovered a way to create illusions that mimicked divine miracles, using her stagecraft and charisma to convince people that she was a chosen one, a conduit to the divine.
And it worked.
It did. She amassed a devoted following who believed her every word, showering her with gifts and carrying out her will. But the question remains, does she genuinely believe in her own fabricated faith? Or is it all just a means to an end, a way to gain power and control over the masses?
Right, that's what makes her such a compelling villain. You never quite know what her true motives are, what's lurking beneath that facade of piety. It's a constant source of tension and intrigue. Okay, so now let's shift gears again and embrace the chaos a little bit. It's time to dive into the backstory of Dr. Ignatius Greybile, a resident mad alchemist.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about Dr. Greybile is that he wasn't always a mad scientist, He started out with a genuine love of science, a thirst for knowledge, and a fascination with the possibilities of alchemy.
Okay.
The article describes him as a child prodigy, devouring books on natural sciences, arcana, and engineering. He excelled in his studies, but he was never content with simply following the established rules. He always wanted to push the boundaries, to experiment, to see what would happen if he just tweaked this formula or added a dash of that volatile ingredient.
Right, and those early experiments didn't always go according to plan, did they?
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
The article mentions a few incidents that are both hilarious and terrifying. Like, remember those carnivorous turnips?
Oh, yeah.
That was one of his early mishaps. He was trying to create intelligent plant life, And, well, let's just say things got a bit out of hand.
Right.
And then there was that time he tried to develop a potion to enhance mental acuity, but accidentally caused uncontrollable hair growth instead.
Oh, no.
I can just imagine the chaos in his lab, gnomes with beards down to their knees tripping over themselves and getting tangled in their own facial hair.
Oh, that's amazing.
But the incident that really got him into trouble, the one that sealed his fate as a mad scientist, was his attempt to create a self-replicating cleaning solution.
Oh no, what could possibly go wrong with that?
Well, it worked a little too well. The solution started consuming everything in sight, nearly devouring his entire lab before he managed to contain it.
Oh, wow.
After that, he was expelled from the Filigree Academy of Magic and Craft, and his reputation as a brilliant but dangerously unpredictable alchemist was solidified.
Right.
But despite all the setbacks, he never gave up on his experiments. He became a freelance alchemist, taking on odd jobs, shady commissions, always searching for that next breakthrough, that next impossible formula.
So he's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous villains are the ones driven by good intentions.
Yeah.
By a belief that they know better than everyone else, that the ends justify the means.
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's step into the shadows and explore the backstory of Ciliara Veilshard, our shadow assassin. Her story is one of betrayal, loss, and ultimately a thirst for vengeance that drives her every action.
Yeah, and unlike some of the other archetypes, Ciliara wasn't born into darkness. She actually grew up among the fading nobility, her family clinging to a semblance of prestige after years of political missteps.
Okay, so she had a taste of the good life before things went sour.
She did. She was trained in diplomacy and etiquette, but she also excelled in physical pursuits, quickly mastering the art of swordplay and developing a natural talent for stealth. It seemed like she had a bright future ahead of her, but fate had other plans.
Right, I'm sensing a tragic twist coming.
There is. During a contentious political trial, her patrons, the very people she was sworn to protect, betrayed her family, framing them for treason to eliminate rivals and consolidate power.
Wow, that's brutal. What happened to her family?
They were stripped of their titles, their wealth, and ultimately their lives. Ciliara was the only one who managed to escape fleeing into the underworld to avoid the same fate.
So she was left with nothing but the burning desire for revenge.
Exactly. She honed her skills in the shadows, learning the art of assassination, mastering poisons, and becoming a ghost, a whisper of death that haunted those who had wronged her.
It's a classic revenge story, but what sets Ciliara apart is her precision, her control, her methodical approach to eliminating her targets. She's not a berserker. She's a predator, patiently stalking her prey and striking with deadly efficiency when the time is right.
It's almost like she's turned her grief and rage into a weapon.
Right.
A cold, calculating instrument of vengeance. But there's also a hint of sadness, a sense of loss that lingers beneath the surface. It makes you wonder if she'll ever find peace, if she'll ever be able to escape the shadows of her past.
Okay, so we've explored the shadows of Ciliara's past, uncovering the betrayal and loss that shaped her into the deadly assassin she is today. Now let's turn our attention to our final archetype, the ambitious and enigmatic Arcane Usurper. What lies beneath the surface of Malric Dustthorn's carefully constructed facade?
Well, Malric's story is one of ambition, resentment, and a thirst for knowledge that ultimately led him to embrace a path of manipulation and control. He wasn't born into obscurity. In fact, he was the youngest son of a prominent tiefling bloodline, a family steeped in wealth power, and a long history of arcane mastery.
Okay, so he had everything going for him, but it still wasn't enough.
It seems that way. Despite his lineage, Malric was never content with simply following in his family's footsteps. He was brilliant, perhaps even more so than his older siblings, but he was also physically frail, often overshadowed by their martial prowess and their commanding presence.
Right. I'm sensing a bit of sibling rivalry here, a feeling of being overlooked and underestimated.
There's definitely that element to his story. While his siblings excelled in combat and politics, he was relegated to the role of the scholar, the one who spent his days poring over ancient texts and delving into the mysteries of magic.
But that didn't deter him. In fact, it fueled his ambition. He realized that true power didn't reside in physical strength or social standing, but in knowledge, particularly in the mastery of magic.
Right.
And so he immersed himself in his studies, searching for an edge, a way to prove himself. And during his research, he stumbled upon something extraordinary. A collection of forbidden texts, known as the Infar Conspiracy. These texts detailed powerful enchantment spells capable of manipulating minds, controlling emotions, and even shaping the very fabric of reality.
Oh, wow.
Forbidden texts, that sounds ominous. What did his family think about this discovery?
They were horrified. They recognized the danger of such power and forbade him from studying the Infar conspiracy, fearing the consequences of his ambition. But Malric was too far gone. He saw these texts as his ticket to greatness, a way to escape the shadow of his family and forge his own path to power.
And that's where things took a dark turn.
They did. Malric continued his research and secret mastering the forbidden arts and honing his skills in manipulation and control. But his ambition got the better of him. In a misguided attempt to prove his worth, he tried to use his newfound powers to influence a key political decision, hoping to sway the outcome in his family's favor.
Oh, that's never a good idea. What happened?
It backfired spectacularly. His manipulations were discovered, and he was accused of treason of trying to undermine his own family for personal gain.
Oh, wow. Talk about a fall from grace. So he was cast out, exiled from the very family he tried so desperately to impress.
He was stripped of his inheritance and banished from his home. He was left with nothing but his knowledge, his ambition, and a burning desire for revenge.
That's a classic tale of hubris and ambition gone wrong. But it also sets up a fascinating character arc. Now that he's been cast out, what will he do with his knowledge? Will he seek redemption? Or will he double down on his pursuit of power, using his magic to manipulate and control those around him?
That's what makes him such a compelling villain. He's a product of his environment, shaped by betrayal and driven by a need to prove himself. He's intelligent, cunning, and ruthless, but there's also a hint of vulnerability, a sense of loss that makes you wonder if he's truly irredeemable.
Okay, so we've explored the backstories of all 5 villainous archetypes, uncovering the events and the choices that shaped them into the formidable figures they are today. We've delved into their motivations, their strengths, and their weaknesses. But what I'm really curious about is, how do you actually run a campaign with a party full of villains? It seems like it would be utter chaos.
It's definitely a unique challenge, one that deviates from the traditional hero's journey in some pretty significant ways. But Paul Bellow provides some great advice for dungeon masters who are brave enough to venture into this morally ambiguous territory.
Okay, let's dive into that DM advice. What are some of the key things to keep in mind when running a villainous campaign?
Well, the first piece of advice is to encourage flawed ambitions. Instead of focusing on external threats, the DM should create scenarios that test the villain's inner demons, their personal struggles, and the boundaries of their morality.
Okay, so it's less about fighting dragons and more about navigating those internal conflicts, those moments where their choices have real consequences, even if those consequences aren't always immediately apparent.
Exactly. For example, imagine a scenario where the fallen hero is offered a chance for redemption, a chance to atone for his past sins. But it would require him to betray his companions, to sacrifice his newfound power, and to embrace a path of selflessness. Would he cling to his anger and his desire for vengeance? Or would he risk everything for a chance at peace? These are the kinds of dilemmas that can lead to some really compelling role-playing moments.
Right, it's like those classic moral quandaries that you see in superhero movies.
Right.
Even villains have to make tough choices, and those choices can have ripple effects throughout the campaign.
For sure.
Okay, the second piece of advice is to balance cooperation and rivalry. It's important to remember that even villains can work together, especially when they have a common goal. But those alliances are often fragile, built on a foundation of mistrust and self-interest.
Exactly.
So it's like a game of chess where everyone is trying to outmaneuver each other, but they also need to be careful not to tip over the board entirely.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. As a DM, you need to create opportunities for the villains to work together to combine their unique skills and abilities to achieve a common goal. But you also need to sow seeds of discord, create situations where their ambitions clash, and force them to make tough choices about loyalty and betrayal.
Right. Imagine the tension when the Arcane Usurper's plans clash with the Corrupt Hierophant's desire for control over the masses, or when the Mad Alchemist's reckless experiments threaten to derail the Shadow Assassin's carefully laid plans.
Right. Those are the moments that can really bring a villainous campaign to life.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got flawed ambitions, cooperation, and rivalry. What else? The third piece of advice is to reward villainy with fallout. Actions have consequences even in a fantasy world. If the villains are successful in their schemes, those successes should come at a price.
So it's not just about winning, it's about dealing with the repercussions of those wins.
Yeah.
What are some examples of fallout?
Well, imagine the fallout after the villains successfully overthrow a tyrannical ruler. There's a power vacuum, chaos in the streets, and rival factions vying for control.
Right.
Or what if their actions inadvertently unleash a powerful magical force, a curse, or a plague that threatens the very world they inhabit? These are the kinds of consequences that can really raise the stakes and force the villains to confront the true weight of their actions.
It's like that saying, be careful what you wish for. Sometimes getting what you want can have unintended and potentially disastrous consequences.
Exactly. The final piece of advice is to offer opportunities for redemption or dissent. It's important to remember that even villains are capable of change. They might start out as ruthless and power-hungry, but over time their experiences, their relationships, and the consequences of their choices might force them to reevaluate their beliefs and their actions.
Okay, so it's not a one-way street to evil. There's always a chance for redemption, for turning away from the darkness and embracing a more noble path.
There is. But the opposite is also true. Some villains might double down on their evil, becoming even more ruthless and destructive as the campaign progresses. It all depends on the choices they make and the consequences of those choices. And that's what makes running a villainous campaign so rewarding. It's a chance to explore the complexities of morality, to challenge the player's assumptions about good and evil, and to create a story that's both thrilling and thought-provoking.
This is making me want to try running a villainous campaign. It sounds like a lot of fun, but also a real challenge for a dungeon master.
It definitely is. But if you're looking for a way to shake things up, to explore those morally gray areas, and to create a campaign that's truly memorable, I highly recommend giving it a shot.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of running a villainous campaign. But now let's dive into the specifics. What makes these archetypes tick? What are the mechanics, the spells, the abilities that bring them to life at the table? Let's start with Sir Thalen, our fallen paladin.
Okay, the article highlights some of his key abilities and spells that really capture the essence of a fallen hero, someone who's turned their back on the light and embraced the shadows.
All right.
So first up is Aura of Hate.
Okay, tell me what makes this ability so fitting for a fallen paladin.
Well, it's pretty straightforward in terms of mechanics, but it's thematically perfect. Sir Thalen's aura actually enhances the melee damage of any undead or fiends within a certain radius, including himself.
Oh, wow. So he's not just a powerful warrior himself, he's also a force multiplier for other evil creatures. That's intense.
It really highlights his connection to the darker aspects of D&D. It's a visual representation of his fall from grace, of how his very presence empowers evil.
And then there's dreadful aspect, which sounds absolutely terrifying.
It is. This is a channel divinity option that basically lets him unleash a wave of fear, causing enemies to become frightened if they fail a wisdom saving throw.
So he's not just a physical threat, he's also a psychological one. He can break the spirits of his opponents before he even swings his sword.
Exactly. And it plays into that classic trope of the fallen hero, someone who's become a symbol of dread and intimidation. It's like his very presence instills fear in the hearts of his enemies.
The article also mentions a few spells that really fit his character. Hellish Rebuke, for instance.
Ah, yes. A classic for any spellcaster who likes to dish out some fiery retribution. It's a reactive spell, so whenever Sir Thalen takes damage, he can unleash a burst of hellfire on his attacker.
It's a great way to show that he's not to be trifled with even if he's wounded. And it plays into that sense of anger and resentment that fuels his actions.
Another spell that highlights his complex nature is Compelled Duel. It basically lets him force an enemy to focus their attacks on him.
Okay.
Tactically, it can be used to protect allies, but it can also be a way for him to satisfy his own thirst for vengeance, to punish those he deems responsible for his fall from grace.
Right, it's that duality again, that constant push and pull between his noble past and his darker impulses.
Exactly.
And then there's Inflict Wounds. It's a spell that allows him to channel negative energy to deal necrotic damage to a target.
It's a very direct, very visceral spell that emphasizes his connection to the darker side of magic. His powers are no longer fueled by divine light, but by something much more sinister.
It's interesting to see how the mechanics of the game reflect those thematic elements, the way his abilities and spells reinforce his fall from grace and his transformation into a force of darkness.
It's one of the things that makes D&D so compelling. It's not just about rolling dice and fighting monsters. It's about storytelling, about creating characters with depth and complexity, and about exploring those moral gray areas that make the game so much more than just a simple battle between good and evil.
Okay, so we've explored the depths of Sir Thalen's abilities and spells. Now let's shift our focus to Sister Lenora, the Corrupt Hierophant. What kind of manipulative magic does she bring to the table?
Well, her abilities and spells focus on deception control and exploiting the faith of others.
Right.
It's a chilling combination, but incredibly effective for a character who thrives on power and influence.
One ability that we already touched on is Invoke Duplicity. It allows her to create an illusory double of yourself, a perfect tool for misdirection, deception, and sowing chaos. I can just imagine the mayhem she could create with that.
Right, imagine her appearing in two places at once, delivering conflicting messages or creating distractions while her accomplices carry out their nefarious deeds. It's like she's playing a grand game of smoke, and Mirror's always one step ahead of those who try to expose her.
And then there's Blessing of the Trickster, which is perfect for a character who's all about stealth and subterfuge.
This ability allows her to grant a creature advantage on stealth checks for a minute. Imagine her using this to bless a group of assassins, making them practically invisible as they stalk their prey through the shadowy streets.
It really emphasizes her role as a leader, but also as a manipulator. She's not just giving orders. She's enhancing the abilities of others, turning them into extensions of her will.
Exactly.
The article also delves into some of Sister Lenora's signature spells, the ones that really capture her essence as a Corrupt Hierophant charm person, for instance. Is a classic for any character who wants to sway hearts and minds.
It's a subtle but incredibly effective spell, allowing her to gain the trust and affection of her targets, often without them even realizing they're being influenced.
Right. Imagine her using Charm Person on a wealthy patron, convincing them to donate generously to her cause, or to turn a blind eye to her less than savory activities. It's a perfect example of how she uses her charisma and her understanding of faith to manipulate those around her.
Hideous Laughter is another spell that fits her character perfectly. I mean, the name alone is both hilarious and terrifying.
It's a great spell for disrupting combat or creating distractions. Imagine her casting it on a powerful guard, turning them into a giggling mess while her accomplices slip past unnoticed. It's a reminder that she's not just a manipulator, she's also a prankster, someone who enjoys toying with her opponents and making them look foolish.
Dispel Magic is a more practical spell, but it also highlights her ability to undermine the power of others.
Okay.
Imagine her using Dispel Magic to shatter an illusion or to break a powerful enchantment, showing her followers that she has dominion over magic itself. It's a powerful statement that reinforces her image as a divine figure.
Suggestion is another spell that plays into her manipulative nature. It allows her to plant ideas in the minds of others, subtly influencing their actions without them even realizing they're being controlled.
It's a perfect spell for a character who likes to operate from the shadows, pulling the strings and watching events unfold according to her plan. Imagine her using Suggestion to convince a rival priest to publicly denounce his own faith or to turn against his allies.
It's a subtle but incredibly effective way to sow discord and manipulate those around her.
And finally, we have Spirit Guardians. Now, this one might seem a bit odd for a trickery domain cleric, but the article suggests a clever twist. Instead of summoning spectral guardians, Sister Lenora could conjure glowing angelic figures that serve as both protectors and a terrifying display of her supposed divine power.
Ooh, that's brilliant. Imagine these radiant beings flanking her as she delivers her sermons, inspiring awe and fear in equal measure.
It's a perfect way to reinforce her image as a chosen one, a conduit to the divine.
Sister Lenora is a fascinating mix of charisma, cunning, and ruthlessness. She's a master manipulator, using her understanding of faith and her mastery of magic to achieve her goals. But now let's shift gears again and embrace the unpredictable. It's time to explore the alchemical chaos of Dr. Ignatius Greybile, our Mad Alchemist.
Dr. Greybile is a force of nature, a whirlwind of ideas, experiments, and often unintended consequences. He's the embodiment of that classic mad scientist trope, but with a dash of D&D magic thrown in for good measure.
Okay, let's dive into some of his signature abilities, starting with experimental elixirs. This is where his chaotic nature really shines through.
Yeah, whenever he creates an elixir, the effects are random, determined by a roll of the dice. You never know what you're going to get. It could be a potion of healing, a strength booster, or something far more bizarre and potentially dangerous.
So it's like playing potion roulette.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic way to introduce an element of surprise and unpredictability into combat and role-playing situations. Imagine Dr. Greybile whipping up a batch of elixirs in the middle of a tense negotiation. One sip could give someone superhuman strength, while another could turn them into a gibbering lunatic.
It's a recipe for chaos, but it also highlights Dr. Greybile's belief that experimentation is the key to unlocking the true potential of alchemy. He's not afraid of failure, he embraces it as part of the process.
His next ability, Alchemical Savant, allows him to enhance the effects of his alchemical creations, boosting either the healing or the damage they inflict.
So he can make his potions even more potent, which is both exciting and terrifying. Imagine him chugging an elixir that not only heals his wounds but also grants him temporary invulnerability.
Or what if he throws a vial of acid that melts through armor like butter? The possibilities are endless, and that's what makes Dr. Greybile such a wild card. He's not just a potion brewer, he's a master of manipulating alchemical energies, pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
The article also highlights some of the infusions that Dr. Greybile can create, giving him even more options for mayhem. Repeating shot, for instance, allows him to modify his hand crossbow to fire multiple bolts in rapid succession.
So he's not just a mad scientist, he's also a bit of a gunslinger. It gives him a ranged attack option, which is useful for a character who's not exactly known for his physical prowess.
Right, and then there's the bag of holding,
Yeah.
a classic D&D staple. But I'm guessing Dr. Greybile uses it in his own unique way.
Instead of storing mundane items like rations and rope, he's probably got it filled with unstable concoctions, volatile chemicals, and maybe even a few extra-dimensional creatures.
Okay, that's both hilarious and terrifying. I can just imagine him rummaging through his bag, muttering, "Where's that vial of concentrated chaos?"
It's a recipe for disaster, but it also highlights his unpredictable nature and his willingness to embrace the unknown.
The article also mentions a few spells that are particularly fitting for a mad alchemist, like Grease and Tasha's Caustic Brew.
Yeah, Grease is a classic for any character who likes to create a little slippery chaos, while Tasha's Caustic Brew is a more potent option, conjuring a cauldron of acid that can burn through almost anything.
I'm starting to see a theme here. Dr. Greybile's spells and abilities are all about chaos, unpredictability, and pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
He's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous villains aren't the ones who are intentionally evil, but the ones who are so caught up in their own pursuits that they fail to consider the consequences of their actions.
Now let's move on to a very different kind of villain, the stealthy and deadly shadow assassin. What kind of skills and abilities make Ciliara Veilshard such a terrifying opponent?
Well, Ciliara is all about precision, efficiency, and striking from the shadows. Her abilities and spells reflect her mastery of stealth, subterfuge, and assassination.
Her signature ability, Assassinate, is as straightforward as it sounds. If she manages to catch an enemy off guard, she gains advantage on attack rolls. And if the target is completely unaware of her presence, she automatically scores a critical hit.
It's a brutal but effective ability that emphasizes her role as a silent killer, a predator who stalks her prey and delivers a swift and decisive blow when the time is right.
Cunning action is another staple for rogues, but it's especially useful for a shadow assassin. It allows her to take a variety of actions like dashing, disengaging, or hiding as a bonus action, making her incredibly slippery and difficult to pin down.
Imagine her darting from shadow to shadow, disappearing and reappearing at will, always staying one step ahead of her opponents. It's a nightmare scenario for anyone trying to track her down.
Reliable Talent is another ability that highlights her consistency and versatility. It essentially guarantees that she'll never roll lower than a 10 on any skill check that uses her proficiency bonus.
So she's consistently skilled in a wide range of abilities, from stealth and acrobatics to deception and persuasion. She's good at almost everything she puts her mind to.
The article also mentions a couple of spells that Ciliara has access to, thanks to her feats. Silent Image is a classic for illusions and distractions, allowing her to create a visual illusion that can fool her opponents or distract them, giving her the opportunity to strike Disguise Self. Is another versatile spell that lets her change her appearance, blending into any crowd or assuming a different identity.
These spells, combined with her natural stealth, her cunning action, make her incredibly difficult to track down. She can slip into any crowd, disappear at a moment's notice, and reappear where you least expect her. It's a perfect blend of mechanics and role-playing, creating a character that's both terrifyingly effective and incredibly fun to play.
Ciliara Veilshard is a truly formidable opponent, a master of stealth, deception, and assassination. But now let's turn our attention to our final archetype, the ambitious and cunning Arcane Usurper. What are the key spells and abilities that make Malric Dustthorn such a dangerous adversary?
While Malric's abilities and spells reflect his mastery of enchantment magic, his ability to control minds, sway emotions, and manipulate those around him to achieve his goals.
One of his most potent abilities is Hypnotic Gaze. It's essentially a magical stun effect, allowing him to paralyze an opponent with a look.
If the target fails a wisdom saving throw, they become incapacitated, unable to move or take actions. Imagine him locking eyes with a charging warrior, freezing them in place as his allies swarm around them.
It's a powerful ability that highlights his control over the minds of others.
Right.
And then there's Instinctive Charm, which is a sneaky way to turn an enemy's aggression against their own allies.
This ability allows Malric to force an attacker who hits him to choose a new target for their next attack.
So he can turn his enemies against each other, creating chaos and sowing discord among their ranks.
Exactly. It plays into his manipulative nature. He's not one for brute force. He prefers to use his enemies' own strengths against them.
The article also highlights some of the spells that make Malric such a dangerous opponent. Charm Person, as we've seen with Sister Lenora, is a versatile spell that allows him to gain the trust and affection of his target suggestion. Lets him plant ideas in the minds of others, subtly influencing their actions and decisions. And then there's Hold Person, which is essentially a more powerful version of Hypnotic Gaze, rendering the target completely helpless.
These spells demonstrate Malric's preference for control and manipulation over direct confrontation. He's a master of subtly influencing events, shaping the world around him to fit his vision.
But he's not afraid to get his hands dirty if necessary.
He's not. The article also lists a few spells that showcase his more aggressive side, like Counterspell and Dominate Person Counterspell, allows him to cancel out an enemy's spell, preventing them from using their magic against him or his allies. Dominate Person is the big one, the spell that really captures Malric's essence as an Arcane Usurper.
Right, this spell allows him to completely control the mind of another creature, forcing them to obey his commands. It's the ultimate form of manipulation, allowing him to turn his enemies into puppets, to use them as pawns in his grand schemes.
Imagine him using Dominate Person to take control of a king, a general, or even a powerful dragon, bending them to his will and using their power to achieve his goals. It's a terrifying thought, but it highlights the true danger of the Arcane Usurper. They're not just powerful spellcasters, they're masters of manipulation, capable of shaping the very course of history with their magic.
It's a reminder that knowledge is power, and that power in the wrong hands can be used to corrupt even the noblest of intentions.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of playing D&D as a villain. We've explored the complexities of these archetypes, their motivations, their strengths, their weaknesses, and the mechanics that bring them to life at the table.
And we've even touched on the unique challenges and rewards of running a Villainous campaign. A campaign where the heroes are the villains, and the lines between good and evil are blurred.
It's a reminder that even in a world of fantasy and magic, the choices we make have real consequences, and that the most compelling stories are often the ones that challenge our assumptions and force us to confront the darker aspects of human nature.
I'm so glad we had a chance to explore this topic. It's really opened my eyes to the possibilities of playing D&D from a different perspective.
It's definitely a refreshing change of pace from the traditional hero's journey, and I think it can lead to some truly memorable campaigns.
A huge thank you to LitRPG Reads and Paul Bellow for providing the inspiration for this deep dive with the article Top 5 D&D Archetypes for Building a Truly Terrifying Evil Party of Players. It's given us a lot to think about.
It has, and it sparked some interesting conversations about the nature of villainy, the complexities of morality, and the power of storytelling in games like D&D.
So for our listeners out there, we'd love to hear your thoughts on these villainous archetypes. Which one resonates with you the most? Have you ever played as a villain in a D&D campaign? What were the challenges and rewards? Share your stories and insights in the comments below.
We're always eager to hear from our community and to delve deeper into these fascinating topics. Until next time, happy gaming.